Nurses who think their doctors end up unemployed. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before the military convoy arrived at St. Michael's. Danielle Ross clocked in at 0600 hours on a Tuesday in March, 6 months after she'd vanished from official existence. 6 months of keeping her head down, her past buried, her hands steady. The ICU ward at St. Michael's Memorial smelled like antiseptic, and underneath it something else: illness, metal, the faint copper undertone of saline solutions mixed with human suffering. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were processing secrets. Danielle moved through the corridor with economical precision, each step measured, her badge clipped to her scrubs at exactly the right angle. Nobody at St. Michael's knew where she'd come from. That was the point. Her shift supervisor, Janet, barely glanced up from the assignment board. Room for 12 and 508. Both stable for now. Post-op recovery in for 12, long-term ventilator patient in 508. Janet's voice had the flat exhaustion of someone who'd worked 12 straight days. Danielle nodded once and headed toward the supply closet to grab her med cart. Other nurses moved around her like water around a stone. They'd learned not to crowd her, not to ask questions. There was something about the way Danielle carried herself that discouraged small talk. It wasn't unfriendly exactly. It was just removed. Professional. The kind of presence that made people check their work twice before speaking. Her locker in the break room was the plainest in the row. A single photo of Mount Rainier taped to the inside of the door. One extra pair of compression socks rolled tight. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic hospital laundry bag, a pair of combat boots. The leather was cracked and weathered, desert dust still embedded in the seams even after the scrubbing she'd given them 3 weeks ago. The boots were from Ramadi, 2009. She touched them once before closing the door. Not a ritual. Just verification that they were still there. That proof still existed, even if everything else had been erased. The mirror above the sink showed her what the hospital staff saw: a woman in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, eyes the color of storm clouds. Watchful eyes. The kind of eyes that measured distances and counted exits. There were scars on her forearms that she couldn't hide, thin white lines that ran perpendicular to her wrists like they'd been carefully placed. She rolled her sleeves down. The limp in her left leg was barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it, and nobody here was looking. That was the advantage of invisibility: people saw what they expected to see. A competent nurse. Quiet. No story. No history. No Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, call sign Reaper 6. Just a woman who showed up, did her job, and didn't ask for anything. She was pushing her med cart toward room for 12 when the grand round started in Conference B, visible through the glass walls. 12 physicians in white coats and one dark suit that had to be hospital administration. Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood at the head of the table, his silver hair styled with the precision of someone who thought a lot about how he looked. He was holding up a chart, Danielle's chart from the previous evening, and even from 50 feet away she could see the red marks he'd made in the margins. "This is excessive," Whitfield announced, his voice carrying across the open floor like a scalpel. "This level of documentation wastes hospital resources. Nobody needs this much detail on routine post-op vitals. It's the kind of thing that comes from nurses who watch too much television and think they're physicians." The other doctors smiled. The kind of smile that said they agreed. The kind of smile that said they thought it was funny. Danielle kept walking. She didn't pause. She didn't look at the window. She didn't let her jaw clench. Her hands remained steady as she logged into the med cart computer. But muscle memory took over. Her shoulders rolled back slightly. Her breathing slowed to something deeper, something practiced. Her mind compartmentalized the information. Whitfield viewed her documentation as a threat, which meant he saw her thoroughness as a challenge to his authority, which meant he would escalate. She'd seen this pattern before. Not in hospitals. In other places. In places where showing competence in the wrong chain of command got you dead. By 1100 hours, Whitfield had moved to the vending machine in the break room. Danielle was getting coffee, black, no sugar, when he came in with an intern. Young guy, maybe third-year medical school, trying to project confidence he didn't feel yet. Whitfield's hand went to the intern's shoulder in that proprietary way that certain men did. "See that, nurse?" Whitfield gestured toward Danielle without looking at her. His voice was pitched just loud enough to carry. That's what happens when nurses get above their station. They think they're doctors. They think their little notes matter. Then one day they're looking for work at a dialysis clinic, wondering where it all went wrong. He paused for effect. Nurses who think they're doctors end up unemployed. Remember that. The intern laughed nervously. Danielle remained motionless. She took her coffee cup from the machine. The liquid was 147 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to burn if you weren't careful. She held it in her hand without reaction. Her jaw was steady. Her eyes were flat. She turned and moved past Whitfield and the intern as if they were furniture. Just before she reached the door, she said one sentence. 5 words. Room 412's glucose is dropping. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a statement delivered in a voice that had commanded men under fire, and something in the way she said it, something in the absolute certainty, made Whitfield turn to watch her go. The morning continued. Vitals to check. Medications to verify. 2 new admissions to the recovery ward. By 1400 hours, Danielle was in the ICU when the stretcher came through the pneumatic doors, moving fast with purpose. Paramedics were giving report to the intake nurse, their voices clipped and professional. Marcus Chen, 38, Special Forces, admitted from Shriners Hospital with post-op complications from previous spinal trauma. Sustained blast injuries in Ramadi approximately 9 years ago, resulting in C5, C6 spinal injury and subsequent paralysis. Currently admitted for revision surgery and management of new-onset PTSD symptoms complicated by infection in the surgical site. Conscious, responsive, moderate anxiety, GCS 15. Vitals stable at this time. Danielle moved toward the gurney without conscious thought. Her eyes found his face first, sharp features, strong jawline, the kind of face that had probably been handsome before the weight of trauma had pressed it into something harder. And then her eyes found his left forearm, the one that was exposed where his sleeve had ridden up during transport. The tattoo was faded but unmistakable. 6 letters in a specific font. Specific to one unit, one operation, one moment in time when everything had changed. Reaper 6. Danielle's entire body went absolutely still. For 3 seconds, she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't process anything except the name on his skin. The world compressed down to exactly that, the tattoo, the man, the impossible fact that he was here in her hospital, on her shift, alive and breathing and with no memory of the woman standing 3 feet away. Because his eyes moved across her face without recognition. There was no spark, no connection, no flash of memory. There was only a man in pain, confused, medicated, looking at a nurse the way he'd look at anyone. A stranger. Just another person in scrubs. She didn't reach out. She didn't speak his name. The professional mask slid back into place with the precision of a door closing. Her voice, when she spoke, was exactly the right tone, calm, competent, utterly removed. I'll take him. Room for 17. ICU monitors, every 4-hour vitals, and he's going to need someone watching the surgical site for signs of infection. The intake nurse nodded and didn't question it. Danielle took the head of the stretcher, her hand steady on the rails, her eyes on the monitors above his head. Not on his face. Not on the tattoo. She'd learned long ago that the best way to survive the impossible was to focus on the immediate task. One breath. One moment. One vital sign at a time. The stretcher wheel squeaked against the tile floor as she pushed him toward the ICU depths. The hallway outside the ICU held the particular silence of a place where people fought death for wages. Danielle's shoes made no sound against the polished floor as she walked, her jaw clenched so tightly she could taste copper. Whitfield's words still hung in the air behind her like smoke. One more instance of overstepping. Security escort. As if she were some kind of threat instead of someone trying to keep a man breathing. She didn't replay the scene in her head. That was a luxury for people who hadn't been trained to compartmentalize. Instead, she moved forward, down the corridor, past the medication station where two nurses pretended not to notice her passing, through the double doors that hissed open with a pneumatic sigh, and into Marcus Chen's room. The veteran was unconscious, his face slack from the sedatives, his chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm with the ventilator. Danielle approached his bedside and did what she always did when the world tried to break her composure. She focused on something smaller. His full line. The dressing. The cardiac monitor lead running under his hospital gown like a thin black snake. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this work not for 6 months but for decades, through dust storms and mortar fire and situations where the wrong move didn't mean a complaint to HR. It meant someone didn't go home. She was adjusting the 4 bag when she saw it. His left forearm, the one that lay across his abdomen. The tattoo. Reaper 6. Coordinates underneath. A date, August 14, 2019. The day everything changed. Her hand froze for exactly half a second, the only involuntary response she allowed herself. Then she continued the 4 adjustment as if her chest hadn't just hollowed out. As if she weren't staring at the arm of a man she had carried 3 miles through enemy fire, through a hail of 7.62 rounds that had punched holes in everything around them, his blood soaking through her kit, her calling him Reaper 6 because that was the only thing keeping him conscious. Stay with me, Reaper 6, stay with me. And then the extraction halo came and she handed him off to the medics and watched him lifted into the night sky. 3 years of Black Ops, erased files, a name that didn't exist anymore. And now he was here. Paralyzed. Forgetting her. She adjusted his pillow. Checked his catheter output. Reviewed his chart on the monitor. Every action the same as it would have been for any patient. That was the training. You don't let emotion compromise the mission. You don't let recognition become liability. She had not carried 12 men out of Ramadi by breaking under pressure. She was not going to break now. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that at 0230 hours, while Danielle sat in the break room reviewing Chen's file, her personal cell phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She knew better than to open it. Personal phones in a hospital were a violation. Texts from unknown numbers were either scams or problems. She opened it anyway. The message was from a Houston area code. Dr. Whitfield is asking about your employment history at Mercy General in San Antonio. What do you want me to tell him? It was her reference. The supervisor from 18 months ago who knew her only as a temporary float nurse, competent but quiet, no friends on staff, no one who would miss her if she disappeared. Danielle sat in the plastic chair, staring at the text. Her coffee from the shift change had gone cold in her hand, the surface filmed over with a thin skin of cream that had begun to separate. She typed back, "Tell him whatever you want." Then she deleted the conversation thread and set the phone on the table in front of her. Whitfield was already making moves. Not just the public humiliation, the vending machine comment, the warning. He was calling people. Activating relationships. Reaching back into her past with the confidence of someone who had never been told no and didn't expect to start now. She understood what was happening. You didn't survive special operations by being slow. Whitfield had recognized that her charting was thorough because it was accurate. That her documentation was meticulous because she was looking for exactly what she'd found: discrepancies in supply orders, equipment delivered that wasn't needed, billing codes that didn't match treatments rendered. He had a scheme. She didn't yet know the shape of it, but she could feel it the way she used to feel IED pressure plates in the ground beneath her feet. Something buried, something lethal, something that required her removal before she could expose it. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the ghost of someone's reheated Thai food. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the kind of insistent buzzing that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. Danielle didn't listen. She folded her hands on the table and did what she had been trained to do. She waited. By 0400 hours, it was worse. The hospital administrator had received a call from the board chairman, who had received a call from Whitfield, who had apparently been very persuasive about the need for an independent investigation into billing irregularities and unauthorized medical procedures conducted by nursing staff. Not Danielle by name. Not yet. But the implication was there, hanging in the air like the smell of antiseptic. Whitfield had brought in an external investigator from a firm that specialized in hospital compliance reviews. A woman named Reeves, who was already reviewing Danielle's charts for pattern anomalies and overutilization of resources. She was thorough, which meant she was dangerous, which meant it was only a question of time before Whitfield's version of events became the official narrative, and Danielle's steady hands and careful documentation became the evidence against her instead of for her. By 0600 hours, when her shift was supposed to end, the administrator asked to see her. She walked into his office knowing what was coming, the way you know what's in a room before you breach it. You can feel the pressure. There's going to be a compliance review, the administrator said. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Routine. Nothing to be concerned about. But we're going to need you to take a temporary suspension while the investigation runs its course. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Just protocol. Protocol. Which meant her badge was already being deactivated. Which meant security would walk her out. Which meant everyone on the nursing staff would understand that she was a liability. I understand, Danielle said. Her voice was still deferential, still quiet, still the voice of someone who had been a nurse for 6 months and not a Master Chief Petty Officer for 18 years. Can I finish my rounds? We'd prefer if you didn't. For administrative purposes. So that was it. She walked out of his office and down the corridor, and her feet carried her to the locker room. Her shoes were still in the bottom locker, placed exactly where she'd left them 6 months ago. Not the hospital-issued white ones. The boots. The ones with dust still in the treads from places that officially never happened, from a mission that had been scrubbed from every database, from a day that she was supposed to have forgotten. She picked them up. They were heavier than the shoes she wore now. Heavier in a way that had nothing to do with weight. The rain started somewhere around midnight. Danielle was sitting in an all-night diner on the east side of Houston by then, the kind of place where nobody asked questions and the coffee was terrible and the waitress who kept refilling her cup was a woman who had probably made every mistake Danielle was about to make. She'd traded her scrubs for jeans and a jacket, and her hair was down instead of braided, and she looked like someone who was about to stop existing. The coffee had gone cold in front of her. Dark liquid. Cold surface. A reflection in the black window behind it that looked like a ghost. She was staring at that reflection and thinking about how many times she'd disappeared before. How simple it was. You just stopped showing up. You let the cover story dissolve. You became someone else. The rain hammered the diner windows like it was trying to get in. Like it was trying to tell her something. But Danielle wasn't listening to weather anymore. She was thinking about the fact that Dr. Whitfield had made his calls, activated his network, brought in his investigator, and started the machinery that was going to process her into unemployment and obscurity. And she was thinking about the fact that Marcus Chen was still paralyzed in a hospital bed, still fighting for breath, still abandoned by 20 different doctors who had decided he was too expensive, too broken, too much work. She thought about staying. About fighting. About burning her cover and walking into Dr. Whitfield's office and telling him exactly who she was. She thought about leaving. About letting him win. About disappearing completely, the way she was supposed to have disappeared after Ramadi. Clean. Final. No loose ends. The waitress set down another cup of coffee that Danielle didn't ask for. Bad night, the woman asked. Bad situation, Danielle said. They usually are, the waitress said, and walked away. Outside, in the Houston darkness, the rain kept falling. And Danielle sat alone with 2 cold cups of coffee and the terrible knowledge that staying meant exposing herself, and leaving meant abandoning a man who had already been abandoned by everyone else. The break room at St. Michael's was empty at 2,300 hours except for the hum of the refrigerator and the fluorescent lights that cast everything in a sickly pale glow. Danielle sat at the chipped formica table with Marcus Chen's medical file spread in front of her, reading through the surgical notes with the attention of someone whose life depended on understanding every detail. 32 years old. Paralyzed from T6 down after an IED detonation in Ramadi 6 months ago. Post-operative complications from spinal fusion repair. The file was thick with rejection letters from specialists, 20 different physicians, all declining his case. 20. That was the number that stuck in her throat like a stone. 20 doctors who had looked at his name, his injury, his paralysis, and found reasons he wasn't worth their time. Too complex. Too experimental. Too unlikely to recover. The insurance wouldn't cover it. The liability was too high. Danielle's fingers traced the edge of the tattoo documented in the admission photo, Reaper 6 inked across his forearm in military serif, the letters worn from years of gear and rope work. She had carried this man 3 miles through kill zones where the air itself seemed to have teeth. The memory wasn't something she let surface often, but his tattoo pulled it up like a fishing hook through deep water. She closed her eyes and saw the date stamp again, 0200 hours. The code button. The crash cart. The thing she had trained her entire life to do. By 0200 hours, the monitors began their screaming. The alarm started as a single high-pitched whine, then multiplied into a symphony of warnings that filled the ICU like an invasion. Danielle was already moving before the second alarm sounded, muscle memory taking over as her boots carried her down the corridor toward the red lights flashing above Chen's bay. His monitor showed what she recognized immediately, the telltale signs of cardiac tamponade. His heart was drowning in its own sac. The pressure around his heart was collapsing the ventricles, strangling his cardiac output with every beat. His lips were turning blue. His eyes were wide with the particular panic of someone whose body is betraying him in real time, gasping for oxygen that his heart is no longer delivering to his brain. She hit the code button on the wall as she entered his room, her hand steady, her voice clipped and certain. Code blue, ICU Bay 7. Get me an attending and an ultrasound machine. Palmer, the night shift resident, was standing in the doorway with his mouth slightly open, frozen in the way that civilians freeze when their training suddenly becomes theoretical. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were still reading the monitors as if they might change their message if he stared harder. What do we, should I call? Palmer's voice was thin with panic. Danielle didn't answer. She was already prepping the pericardiocentesis kit, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who had done this in the back of a Humvee with rounds pinging off the armor plating, done it in a field hospital in Kandahar where the power kept cutting out and she had to work by chemical light stick. The needle came out of the kit. The antiseptic swabs. The syringe. Chen's systolic pressure hit 70 and kept falling. Time was no longer measured in minutes. It was measured in heartbeats. Move, she said to Palmer, not unkindly, but with the absolute authority of someone whose suggestion was not a suggestion. She positioned Chen on his back, palpated the xiphoid process at the base of his sternum, and found the angle, just below the xiphoid, toward the left shoulder at a 45-degree angle. The needle was 17 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial sac. She had done this exactly twice before under fire. She was about to make it 3. The syringe felt like an extension of her arm. Her breathing was controlled, measured, coming from somewhere deep in her diaphragm where panic couldn't reach. She advanced the needle with steady pressure, watching Chen's face, watching the monitors, listening to the oxygen saturation alarm that was now screaming continuously. 76%. 72. The needle touched the pericardium and there was a subtle give, the membrane yielding to pressure like puncturing a balloon 1 millimeter thick. Dark blood filled the syringe. It was immediate, the kind of immediate that told you the diagnosis had been absolutely correct. 20 milliliters of blood had been strangling his heart. Chen's color came back like someone was slowly turning up the brightness on a dimmed photograph. His systolic pressure climbed from 70 to 85 to 92. His lips shifted from blue back toward pink. His eyes, which had been wide with animal panic, began to refocus. The oxygen saturation alarm quieted as the numbers crept upward, from 72 to 80 to 88 to 94. Sinus rhythm. A strong, regular beat that sounded like something coming back to life. The code team arrived 30 seconds later, rushing in with the crash cart and the defibrillator and the weight of 4 years of medical school behind them. They stopped in the doorway of Bay 7 and looked at the monitors. They looked at Chen, whose color had stabilized and whose breathing had steadied. They looked at Danielle, who was calmly disposing of the needle into the sharps container while Palmer stood useless in the corner, his frozen expression having shifted from panic to something closer to awe. He went into tamponade at 0202, Danielle said, her voice measured and calm. Pericardiocentesis performed at 0203. 30 milliliters drained. Vitals stabilizing. She gestured toward the ultrasound machine that had arrived behind the code team. He should have imaging to rule out reaccumulation. The attending physician, a man named Garrett who had seen 50 years of medicine and rarely looked surprised, nodded once and took over the next steps with the smooth efficiency of someone who recognized competence when he saw it. Danielle stepped back from the bedside and moved toward the door where Palmer was still standing with his hands hanging at his sides like he'd forgotten they were attached to his body. "Go get some coffee," she said to him quietly, passing his shoulder. "You did fine. Stay here. You'll learn more watching the imaging than you will from the coursework." It wasn't kindness, it was the kind of direct statement that teachers give to students who have just learned something about their own limits. Palmer nodded slowly and moved toward the monitors. By 0600 hours, word had spread through the hospital in the way that medical gossip spreads, through text messages sent between shifts, through comments made in the break room, through the subtle current of whispers that runs beneath every institution. A nurse had performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without direct physician orders. A nurse had saved a patient's life while the resident stood paralyzed. A nurse had done what 20 doctors had refused to do. She had looked at a paralyzed man and decided he was worth saving. By 0800 hours, Dr. Whitfield was in the ICU reviewing the overnight notes, his face darkening with each line he read. His jaw moved like he was working something bitter out from between his teeth. Danielle was 3 beds away, documenting Chen's hourly vitals, when she felt the particular weight of his stare. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She had felt that stare directed at her across crowded rooms for 6 months. It was the stare of someone whose carefully constructed world had just encountered a problem that didn't fit into any of his preferred categories. By 0830 hours, the administrator called her down to his office. Not for a congratulations. Not for a commendation. A summons. The kind you received when something you had done had created complications that extended beyond the immediate medical success. Her badge was already flagged in the system. She could feel it the way a soldier feels when they've crossed a line and there's no walking it back. Danielle set down her pen, closed her documentation system, and stood up from the computer terminal. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She looked down at her scrubs and made note of the fact that they were clean, that her appearance was professional, that there was nothing in her demeanor that would suggest she had just upended the power structure of an entire medical institution by daring to do her job. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the thing that would happen next, the machinery that was already in motion, the calls that Whitfield was making, the favor he was calling in from the board chairman, the external investigator he was already bringing in to review her charts and her credentials, and the mysterious gaps in her employment history that she had worked so hard to obscure. Danielle had trained for combat. She had trained for extraction and evasion and maintaining her cover under enemy interrogation. But she had never trained for this, the particular kind of institutional warfare that was about to unfold in the corridors of a hospital where she had spent 6 months trying to disappear. She walked toward the administrator's office with the composed gait of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything still to protect. By morning, Dr. Whitfield had already made 3 phone calls. The first was to Gerald Masterson, the board chairman, who owed him a favor, a malpractice case buried 2 years ago, documents sealed, attorney fees paid discreetly. Whitfield didn't ask. He stated, "We have a nurse performing surgical procedures without supervision. This is a liability nightmare." Masterson listened. Master-son understood. The second call went to Denver, to the hospital where Danielle had worked before Houston. Whitfield's voice carried concern. We're seeing some concerning patterns. Instability. Difficulty accepting authority. Has your department noted any PTSD indicators? Her former supervisor, bound by HR protocol, confirmed only dates of employment, but the implication was there, hanging in the silence like smoke. That was enough. By afternoon, an external investigator named Richard Devereaux sat across from Whitfield in a private office. Devereaux specialized in building termination cases. He carried a leather portfolio and a practiced expression of professional neutrality. Whitfield handed him Danielle's charting from the past 6 months, meticulous documentation, every vital sign recorded, every medication logged with timestamps. What you're looking for, Whitfield said, is the pattern of her overstepping. She thinks she's a physician. Devereaux made notes. He knew exactly what to look for when you told him what to find. By evening, the hospital's risk management director, Thomas Hardin, received a call from Whitfield's office. They were scheduling a formal meeting. Tomorrow morning. Administrator. Risk management. Danielle Ross would be present. The word suspension was used twice in that conversation. She arrived for her shift at 06 for 5 hours, her badge still functioning, her hand still steady as she moved through the ICU. Marcus Chen's monitors showed stable sinus rhythm. O2 sat at 94%. The pericardiocentesis had held. No reaccumulation of fluid. His blood pressure had normalized. She adjusted his pain medication by 2 milligrams and made a note, patient stable. Responsive to voice commands. At 0900 hours, her phone buzzed. A text from the front desk, report to administrator's office immediately. She didn't hesitate. She didn't check her reflection. She simply moved, the same fluid precision that had carried her through Ramadi, through 3 tours, through 16 extractions. Composure was armor. Composure was silence. Composure was the only weapon they couldn't take from her. The administrator's office occupied the northeast corner of the hospital, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Danielle had never been inside. She knocked once and entered. Dr. Whitfield stood near the desk, his tailored suit pressed, his expression arranged into something resembling regret. Beside him sat Thomas Hardin from Risk Management, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a folder stamped, confidential. Between them stood a woman Danielle had never met, the nurse manager from the surgical floor, Margaret Reeves, her face carefully neutral. The administrator, Dr. James Chen, gestured for Danielle to sit. She remained standing. Whitfield began, Ms. Ross, last night you performed an invasive surgical procedure. Specifically, a pericardiocentesis. Without physician supervision. Without authorization from a licensed physician. Danielle kept her voice level. The patient was in cardiac tamponade. Blood accumulation in the pericardial sac. His O2 sat was dropping. Systolic BP 78/40. The on-call resident, Dr. Patterson, was present in the ICU. He assessed the patient and did not intervene. You don't have the training, Whitfield said, his voice sharp now. You don't have the authority. The patient would have died. Danielle's gaze moved to each face in the room. In approximately 3 minutes, his heart would have entered complete circulatory collapse. I drained 30 milliliters of blood from the pericardial space. His sinus rhythm returned. His O2 sat climbed from 68 to 92%. He is alive because of the intervention. Thomas Hardin opened his folder. According to our preliminary investigation, you performed a procedure that requires physician-level credentials. Our liability exposure on this is substantial. If there had been a complication. There wasn't, Danielle said. But there could have been, Hardin continued. This hospital could face a lawsuit. You could be charged with practicing medicine without a license. He looked at Dr. Chen. The risk here is enormous. Whitfield leaned forward. You're suspended, effective immediately. pending a full external investigation. Your badge access is revoked. You are not to enter this facility until the review is complete. The words landed like rounds downrange. Precise. Unavoidable. Danielle's jaw tightened fractionally, a muscle contracting near her temple, invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to see it. Her hands remained at her sides. Her breathing remained steady. She had survived worse than this. She had survived impossible things. I want to be clear about something, Margaret Reeves said, speaking for the first time. Her voice carried something that might have been sympathy. This isn't personal. It's protocol. We can't have nurses performing surgical interventions. Even if the outcome is good, the precedent is dangerous. Danielle met her eyes. 20 doctors have refused to help this patient since he arrived. 20. He was given up on. I didn't refuse. The room went very still. Dr. Chen cleared his throat. You'll receive formal notification by end of business today. Your suspension letter will detail the investigation process. Your union representative has been notified. Human Resources will process your termination paperwork pending the outcome of the review. How long? Danielle asked. 2 to 4 weeks, Hardin said. Depending on what the investigator finds. She turned and walked out without another word. By 1400 hours, security arrived at the ICU. Not roughly, 2 officers she recognized, men she had smiled at in the break room, but the message was clear. They escorted her to her locker in the staff room while other nurses worked, their eyes carefully averted, their presence a wall of learned silence. Danielle had arrived at St. Michael's with 1 pair of shoes and 6 pairs of scrubs. She removed the combat boots from the bottom of the locker. Boots that had walked through Ramadi. Boots that had carried her and others through fire. She held them against her chest, their leather still salt-stained from sweat and dust that never fully washed out. Around her, the room stayed quiet except for the sound of lockers opening and closing, the everyday rhythm of shift changes. One nurse, Jennifer, someone Danielle had trained on the latest wound care protocol, approached quietly. I saw what happened, Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. In the hallway. When they were taking you to your locker. I saw. Danielle waited. Marcus Chen is asking for you, Jennifer continued. Every time he wakes up. He keeps saying the same thing. Where's my nurse? Where's the woman with the steady hands? Danielle nodded once. She slipped the boots under her arm and walked toward the emergency bay exit. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical lullaby. The wall smelled of antiseptic and something else, the particular staleness that accumulated in buildings where people spent the worst days of their lives. She had lived in places like this before. She knew how to move through them. At the exit, she pushed the door open. The Houston heat hit her like a physical thing. 78 degrees. 87% humidity. The kind of air that made it difficult to breathe if you weren't used to it. She was used to worse. She was used to everything. She kept walking across the parking lot without looking back, without acknowledging the security officers who watched from the entrance, without letting anyone see what was happening inside her chest. But that wasn't the worst part. What Whitfield didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the moment Danielle walked out of St. Michael's, a series of phone calls had already been placed. Calls from Marcus Chen's bedside. Calls from a retired brigadier general who had received a text message from his son reading only 4 words, the nurse. It's her. Reaper 6. That night, at 0300 hours, Danielle sat alone in an all-night diner on the east side of Houston. The kind of place where insomniacs and night shift workers gathered around coffee that had been warming on a burner for 6 hours. The fluorescent lights flickered in a rhythm that suggested electrical failure was imminent. A drunk couple argued in the parking lot outside. A solo driver at the counter ate pie and said nothing. She stared at her reflection in the black window, half visible, half ghost, and thought about the orders from 3 years ago. The orders that had made her disappear. The orders that said she didn't exist in any official capacity. The orders that promised if she was identified, they would not acknowledge her. Disappearing completely might be easier. Walking away. Finding another hospital, another city, another name. Becoming someone else entirely. She had done it before. She could do it again. The coffee went cold in front of her. The diner's exhaust fan rattled. Somewhere in the city, a siren wailed toward someone else's crisis. She held the combat boots against her legs and thought about Marcus Chen, paralyzed and alone, asking for hands that knew how to help. 20 doctors had said no. The system had said no. But she had said yes, and now that yes was being erased. That was the particular cruelty of institutional machinery. It could undo heroism and call it protocol. It could silence you and call it policy. It could terminate you and call it procedure. She had survived worse than this. But she had never trained for this kind of warfare. The kind that didn't involve weapons or enemies you could see. The kind that happened in conference rooms and involved people whose names you didn't know, whose faces you forgot immediately, whose decisions felt like weight pressing down from above. She picked up her phone. Looked at it. Did not call anyone. 72 hours of silence. That's what Danielle had endured since security walked her out of St. Michael's. 3 days of her phone not ringing, no calls, no explanations, no appeals. 3 days of sitting in her apartment with the combat boots on the table in front of her, leather cracked from Ramadi dust, laces still holding the knot she'd tied in 2011. 3 days of wondering if Whitfield had finally won. Then at 1,100 hours on a Tuesday morning, everything changed. 3 hums rolled into the St. Michael's parking lot in formation. Military precision. The kind of arrival that made security guards straighten and parking attendants move. A staff car followed, black sedan, government plates, and when it stopped, a man in dress blue stepped out. Colonel. Full chest of ribbons. Eyes like concrete. He didn't walk through the front entrance like a normal visitor. He went straight through the administrator's office door, and the woman behind the desk looked up from her computer with the expression of someone watching a tornado materialize inside her filing cabinet. "I'm looking for Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross," the colonel said. Not a question. A demand. His voice had the weight of command authority, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, from having given orders that got men killed and lived with it anyway. The administrator's face went pale. We don't have anyone by that. Not here." The colonel turned back toward the hallway. "Conference room. Now. I want Dr. Whitfield, your board chairman, and anyone else who participated in her termination." 40 minutes later, Dr. Whitfield sat in the hospital's largest conference room with 8 board members, the hospital's legal counsel, and the colonel. The general arrived next, Marcus Chen's father, Brigadier General Chen, retired but carrying the kind of presence that made everyone else feel like they were standing on borrowed ground. Behind him came a security guard Danielle recognized from the hospital, a veteran, maybe 60, with a scar across his left temple. The general opened a file folder. Inside it sat a medical photograph. A tattoo. Reaper 6, inked on a forearm in the precise military style of a call sign earned in blood. The general slid it across the table toward Whitfield. "My son has that tattoo on his left forearm," the general said. His voice was steady, almost conversational. He got it the day after a special forces operator carried him 6 miles through enemy fire in Ramadi. That was 2011. That operator was classified so far above top secret that her records were scrubbed, her identity sealed, her existence officially denied. Command orders. Black Ops. The kind of detail that doesn't exist in any hospital database. Whitfield's face had started to shift. Confusion first, then recognition beginning to bloom. "You fired that operator from this hospital 72 hours ago," the general continued. He opened the folder wider. Inside were citations. Plural. For saving your son's life. For performing a pericardiocentesis at 0200 hours when your on-call resident froze. for draining blood from his pericardial sac while everyone else stood still and watched him die. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming, that electrical buzz that most people never notice until silence makes it impossible to ignore. You had no idea who you were standing next to, the general said. That's your only excuse for this level of stupidity. The colonel pulled out his phone. On the screen, a video began to play. It was from the moment Marcus Chen had woken up. From the moment he recognized the tattoo on his own arm. From the moment memory returned, fragments at first, then the full clarity of 3 miles through enemy territory with bullets pinging off rocks and a woman's hands, steady and impossible, keeping him alive. She carried me 6 miles, not 3, Marcus said on the video. His voice was different now, stronger, awake, no longer the blank-eyed victim in the hospital bed. I remember now. I remember her face. I remember the sound of her boots. I remember her call sign. Reaper 6. That's what they called her. In the conference room, Whitfield's chest had begun to rise and fall faster. His hands were pressed flat on the table. They trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that the ground beneath him was collapsing. The veteran security guard stood up. He moved to the center of the room, placed his hand over his heart, and saluted, a crisp, decisive motion that had survived decades since his own service. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, he announced, his voice resonating like a bell. Welcome home. You had her suspended, the general said quietly, for following proper protocol on a veteran patient. You had her fired for saving a man you and your colleagues had given up on. 20 doctors, Mr. Whitfield. 20 physicians who looked at Marcus Chen and decided his case was too complicated, his injuries too extensive, his future too uncertain. 20 doctors who walked away. 1 nurse, 1 Master Chief Petty Officer, who stayed. Someone's phone was buzzing. Then another. Then a third. Notifications. The kind that start quietly and then explode. The video of this moment, the moment the general read the citations, the moment Marcus Chen whispered her call sign, the moment the security guard saluted, had somehow leaked. Someone in the room had recorded. By lunchtime it was on local news. By evening, it was national. The hashtag #Reaper6 trended within hours. Veteran advocacy groups began sharing the story. Local news anchors asked the same question on loop, are we abandoning our heroes? But the real avalanche started when someone dug deeper. When nursing records from St. Michael's suddenly became very interesting to people in very official positions. An anonymous tip, later traced to a nurse named Rodriguez who'd been documenting Whitfield's scheme for months, keeping meticulous records of inflated billing codes and supply orders that didn't match actual usage, sent everything to the state medical board. The pattern became clear, 23 cases over 18 months where Whitfield had systematically overbilled veteran care. Inflated diagnostic codes. Unnecessary procedures. Kickback payments disguised as consulting fees to a medical supply contractor named Torres. Torres cracked within 48 hours. Facing fraud charges, he became a witness and provided emails. Everything. Years of them. The conspiracy unraveled like a pulled thread. But the final blow came from the direction Whitfield would have least expected. Dr. Raymond Keating, his former mentor at Johns Hopkins, the man who'd written his recommendation letters, who'd sponsored his fellowship, saw the viral video. Keating watched the moment where Whitfield said nurses who think their doctors end up unemployed to an intern, hours before a nurse who was actually a Master Chief Petty Officer had saved a patient's life while residents and physicians froze. Keating released a public statement that morning, I am appalled and ashamed. I withdraw any professional association with Dr. Whitfield. His actions represent a betrayal of every value I attempted to teach him. His voice on the news sounded like a man who'd been forced to confront his own failure in hiring him. The medical community followed Keating's lead like dominoes. Whitfield's hospital privileges suspended. His state license entered review. 3 malpractice attorneys announced investigations into his veteran patients. Within a week, he'd been unemployed. Within 2 weeks, he was unemployable. No hospital would touch him. No practice would hire him. His name had become radioactive, the kind of professional pariah status that doesn't recover. 6 months later, Danielle Ross stood in her office at the new Veterans Recovery Center in Houston, sunlight pouring through windows that overlooked the parking lot. A facility built with private donations after her story went public. She ran the entire veterans wing, 60 beds, full autonomy over protocols, a staff she'd personally selected. Nurses who believed in never giving up. Doctors who understood that survival isn't measured in probability percentages. On her desk sat the combat boots from Ramadi. Worn leather holding down a stack of commendation letters. One from Marcus Chen, who was regaining upper body strength in physical therapy 3 times a week. One from the veteran security guard. 18 more from patients who said she refused to give up when everyone else did. Through her window, she watched the parking lot. A man in a cheap suit sat at a folding table outside a strip mall across the street, a banner reading affordable supplemental insurance flapping in the Houston wind. Dr. Whitfield. His car was a 10-year-old sedan parked at an angle that suggested he'd parked it quickly, without care. He looked up toward the hospital windows, seemed to sense her gaze, and quickly looked away. Danielle didn't smile. Her face remained composed, the professional mask of someone who'd spent her entire career giving nothing away. But she held his gaze until he started packing up his materials. Until the folding table collapsed. Until the sedan pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared into afternoon traffic. Her phone rang. It was the general. "Master Chief, we have 3 more patients the VA's given up on. Can you take them?" Danielle glanced at the boots on her desk, then at the empty beds visible through her office door. At the wall behind her, where 20 commendation letters hung in simple frames, each one representing someone the system had written off, someone she'd refused to abandon. "Send them over, sir," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Became command. Became the person she actually was. "We don't give up here." After she hung up, she walked to the window one more time. Whitfield's sedan was gone. The folding table was gone. The insurance banner was gone. Only the empty parking space remained, and in it, a single piece of paper tumbling across the asphalt in the wind. She turned back to her desk and picked up the first patient chart. On the wall behind her hung a single framed quote, handwritten in precise military script, "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." Below it, 20 photographs, the 20 doctors who had refused Marcus Chen. Their names were redacted. Their faces were blurred. Not for privacy, but as a reminder. As evidence. As a monument to the moment when 20 credentials meant nothing, and one person without a credential meant everything. If you've been underestimated, if you've been told to give up, if you know someone who has, share this story. Subscribe for more tales of heroes who refuse to accept the system's verdicts. Comment below, if you were Marcus Chen's family, would you have made those calls? What would you have done? Like this video and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story about the quiet ones who change everything.